Now we are going to discuss about respiration in plants. Here, respiration. All living organisms respire. So why they are respiring? Why they are breathing? Here we will discuss about these questions. Here, all living organisms require some energy for their metabolic activities. So every time, every day, they are in the body of plant or animals, some functions are going on continuously. For these metabolic activities, some energy is required. So how the organisms get energy? So the energy is coming from our food material. So we are also taking some food material. So from these food material, we are getting energy. Plants are also synthesizing food materials by photosynthesis. So by photosynthesis process, they are synthesizing the food material. The food material is in the form of starch or sucrose or glucose. So they get energy from their food material. Here the food materials are of different types. So generally the respiratory substrate respiration is also called as breathing. So what is breathing? Here the breathing is intake of oxygen and a release of carbon dioxide. So what is happening in this process? Here intake of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide. So in the presence of oxygen, here the food materials are oxidized. So by the oxidation of food materials, some energy is released outside. So that energy is trapped and that energy is converted into the chemical energy, or that is stored in the form of ATP. So all living organisms are getting energy from their food material. So in the food materials are oxidized during the breathing process or during the respiration process. So due to the oxidation of food materials, the energy is released. So that energy is stored in the form of ATP. Here respiration or breathing. Here intake of oxygen and a release of carbon dioxide. So during this process, here some energy is released. Food materials are oxidized. In this process, the food materials are oxidized, and in the oxidation process, energy is released. Some energy is released. This energy is stored in the form of ATP. So what is ATP? Here ATP is it is one nucleotide, and ATP is adenosine triphosphate. Here ATP adenosine triphosphate. Here three phosphates are present in the ATP. Here ATP is also called as energy currency of cell. It is also called as energy currency of cell. So whenever the cell requires energy, so based on the requirement, here the ATP is giving the energy. So in the ATP, the phosphate is oxidized, or it is hydrolyzed. So from this ATP, some energy is released. So that energy is utilized by the cell or organism for different activities. So it is the main purpose. Here the respiration main aim is to produce energy from their food material. So the food material is oxidized, and in the oxidation process energy is released. That energy is stored in the form of ATP. So the ATP is here whenever the cell requires or organism requires energy, so they get energy from ATP. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and it is also called as energy currency of cell. in plants, here the respiratory substrate, here the respiratory substrate or raw material. The raw material is generally sucrose, glucose, sucrose, all these are carbohydrates. How the glucose is derived? So this glucose, mainly the respiratory substrate is glucose. In almost all plants or all organisms, the respiratory substrate is glucose. So this glucose is derived from sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide. It is disaccharide. And glucose is monosaccharide. Yeah, the sucrose is the end product of photosynthesis. In photosynthetic organisms, the end product is sucrose. Yeah, the sucrose is converted into glucose and fructose in the presence of the sucrose is the end product of photosynthesis. In all plants, in all photosynthetic plants, the end product sucrose is synthesized. This sucrose is converted into, or it is split into glucose and fructose. So these two are monosaccharides. In the presence of invertase enzyme, disaccharide is converted into glucose, fructose, monosaccharides. So this glucose is the raw material, or this glucose is generally it is utilized or it is involving in the respiration. So the glucose is the common respiratory substrate. And if you see the respiration equation, the respiration generally C6H12O6 and in the presence of oxygen. If it is aerobic respiration, here oxygen is utilized, and in this process carbon dioxide is released. Carbon dioxide and water is released, and some energy also in this process, some energy is also released. So this energy, here some energy in the form of heat, some energy in the form of chemical energy. So some energy is released outside, it is not useful, it is not stored. Some energy is stored in the form of chemical energy or ATP. So total energy here 686 kilocalories energies or 2870 kilojoules. So in the presence of enzymes, it is a enzymatic reaction. The respiration is a enzymatic reaction. A number of enzymes are involving in the oxidation process. So here enzymes are involving. So in the presence of enzymes, the glucose is oxidized, or glucose is completely oxidized or converted into carbon dioxide and water. Some energy is released. That energy is some energy is stored in the form of ATP, some energy here it is released in the form of heat. So here it is a aerobic respiration equation. Next, here respiratory substrates. The respiratory substrates, here different substrates, different raw materials are involving in the respiration.